Ok. Boa tarde a todos, pessoal. Muito obrigado por ter aceitado estar aqui presentes. Hoje teremos um CEBIMário a mais. Hoje teremos o nosso convidado, o professor Dr. Daniel Blumstein, da Universidade da Califórnia, Los Angeles. Thanks, Daniel, for accepting this invitation. I think this is very important, your presentation. And, well, you have 30 minutes or more for your talk. And after return for the question, the people normally put your question in the chat, and I will to try to read this question with you. Okay?
Okay, so as you may or may not know, I can't see anybody. I don't even see myself. The last time I gave a talk where I couldn't see myself, the whole system went down and I talked for an hour and no one saw me. So there you go. So hopefully this will work. Anyway, it's really a pleasure to be here today. And really what I want to do is I've sort of cut down a longer talk into a shorter talk, and I hope I can get through this in about 30 minutes. But what I want to do is really think about conservation behavior, and I want to think about how anti-predator behavior has really important implications for how we manage wildlife. So biomedical scientists clearly understand that there is translational research. So the US National Institute of Health talks about this idea of from bench to bedside, biomedical research that has a clear human health benefit. And I think that, thinking about animal behavior in general, there are many applied aspects of animal behavior. So research that takes fundamental insights from behavioral biology and ultimately applies them to wildlife management, I would define as translational wildlife research. I think a theme of this is that we need to think about mechanistic studies that will permit us to think about how animals respond to anthropogenic stimuli. Now, there are a number of different frameworks to think about conservation behavior. My colleague and friend Oded Berger-Tal proposed one a number of years ago, where there are behaviors, he calls them behavioral domains, seen over here, and we can think about how they might interact with anthropogenic impacts, and anthropogenic impacts may change behavior. But when you think about behavior-based management, these domains may be useful for that, and behavior-based management may itself change behavior. Behavior also can be an indicator of anthropogenic disturbance or an indicator of something that is useful. So there are a variety of ways to think about this. Oded and Alison Greger and I recently sort of took a step back and wrote an annual review of Ecology, Evolution, and Systematics, where we sort of squinted and said, well, if you think about it, there are many ways that we can manage human-wildlife conflicts and questions. And that at some level, really, it's about, do we want to attract animals or do we want to repel animals? So when I say conservation, I think about we have too few of something and we want more of them. And in that case, we might want to attract animals to various places, good habitat, safe habitat. And when I think about human-wildlife conflict, I think about humans perceiving there as being too many individuals, and therefore we want to repel them. So we created something we call cognitive-based management. And is there a clear need to attract or repel? In some cases, you might be doing something, you might be having scarecrows and hazing, and that may be effective. But if not, we need to maybe consider something else. So cognitive-based management focuses on the decisions animals make about approaching or avoiding specific features or resources, and it provides a mechanistic understanding of conservation failures and maybe successes. So when people go out and cull badgers in the UK or possums in New Zealand, and that fails to reduce tuberculosis, that may be because neighbors are attracted to these vacant territories. And if we knew about the factors that influenced attraction or repulsion, we might be able to come up with better management outcomes. So again, this may explain why certain manipulations we create may create ecological and evolutionary traps. Planting trees in the desert to reforest desert areas in Israel created perches for lizard-eating birds that then ate endangered species of lizards, and that wasn't a good outcome. Now, I think no matter what we do, and really everything I'm talking about today has to be framed in the context of evidence-based decision-making. It's the key to developing effective conservation and management outcomes. Now we know that there's an active adaptive management. Management plans are modified based on the results of well-designed experiments that collect data on factors or variables that are demonstrably important for conservation or management. But there also is passive adaptive management. And in many cases, when managers are dealing with endangered species, they really don't have the ability in some cases to do active adaptive management. You know, if you're doing the same old that you know is a fatal outcome, maybe you can't do that and you have to try less well-designed experiments. So regardless, the idea of building in an adaptive management framework into asking these questions, does it help, is going to be important. What's the evidence that any of these ideas has a desirable effect size? What is that effect size? So adaptive management is essential for anything, you know, I'm talking about today. I'm going to talk briefly about the evolutionary ecology of fear and thinking about tolerance of people. I'm going to talk about anthropogenic noise and what I call the distracted prey hypothesis. I'm going to talk about the natural history of habituation and the contiguous habitat hypothesis, and then think broadly about what happens when species lose their predators. So why am I talking about anti-predator behavior? And what is anti-predator behavior? Well, anti-predator behavior are things animals do to reduce the probability of being detected by a predator, attacked by a predator, or killed by a predator. And it includes a suite of adaptations that animals have to detect predators, to identify them, to engage in anti-predator vigilance, to escape from predators, they flee them, they use refugia, and to communicate about them. And, you know, why study anti-predator behavior? Because it has a huge impact on, individual fitness. Predation is a strong selective force that influences habitat selection and population persistence. The marmots I study in Colorado persist, you know, over decades in places with good visibility and protective rocks. Food isn't the issue. Persistence over time is a function of safety and security. There also are a variety of indirect effects of predation risk on populations and communities. Fear alone may influence where animals go and what they do. Fear alone may structure communities. And predation is often a hugely important cause of wildlife management failures. If we translocate or reintroduce animals to a new area, well, we often find that they don't make it. Why don't they make it? They get killed by predators. So we need to understand something about anti-predator behavior. We also know that humans change animals' behavior. And Alejandro Fried and Larry Dill wrote a wonderful paper years ago where they said a key to understanding how humans impact animals is to view people as predators. We know that predators approach animals and animals flee and hide from them. So I went out and started this journey a number of years ago by asking the question, why do only some species tolerate disturbance? And I focused on birds because birds exhibit a variety of life history and natural history traits. And I focused initially on thinking about something called flight initiation distance at which an individual flees an approaching person. Now we know this is a method to quantify perception of predation risk, and it's also a method that can aid in wildlife management. Initially, I developed a comparative data set with about 10,000 flushes on about 300 species of birds. But colleagues and I from around the world have been expanding these data sets and doing a variety of meta-analyses. Meta-analysis, as you probably know, looks for a weighted average effect size for many studies. And these days it can handle phylogenetic relationships in both fixed and random effects, and we can find groups that respond differently. So in this initial meta-analysis that Ted Stankiewicz and I did, we found that fish, but not other taxa, tolerate closer approaches as group size increases. Why? Well, maybe because fish engage in collective defense. I made the prediction that, you know, I bet muskox would do the same thing, and tried to get Joel Berger to look at that when he was studying muskox, and he never really looked at it in the way I wanted to study it. But, you know, I think that understanding that all species may not respond the same way is also important. And meta-analysis heterogeneity statistics are important. colleague and I edited a book, and we asked Anders Moller to do a meta-analysis of flight initiation distance in birds. And it decreases with urbanization, it increases with body mass, it varies with predation risk, it decreases with increasing latitude. Latitude often is associated with predators, the number of predators. So if there are fewer predators, animals should tolerate closer approaches from humans. It decreases with sociality because there's collective benefits from being social. It decreases with parasitism, maybe because animals are sick and are allocating energy elsewhere. It increases with hunting. There also are life history and habitat openness effects. Diogo Samia and I did a number of meta-analyses looking at tolerance to humans and flight initiation distance. In lizards, we found that there are costs of fleeing effects, that food availability and social interactions influence FID, that habitat selection effects, distance to refuge, perch height and cover influence FID. There are experimental effects, predator density, sequential attacks. As risk goes up, FID increases. There are predatory effects, approach speed, the directness of approach, whether a predator is looking at you or not, size, scares animals more, increases FID. There are a variety of physiological effects, but interestingly, these are rather smaller. We and colleagues also did a meta-analysis of FID in fishes, and we found that shoaling behavior and species body size and longevity and trophic level and environment, and whether an area was protected or not, all had significant effects on FID. But interestingly, in this larger study, not group size, whereas Ted and I had previously found that. But what about tolerance to humans? So we know that species vary in whether you can get close to them or not. And I'm very interested in ecotourism. I love going places and seeing wildlife. And I've always worried about how we might be changing the behavior of those wildlife. And we know that tolerance itself varies. So Diogo and I said, well, what is tolerance? Tolerance at some sort of essential level is if you're studying the same species in an area with lots of people and you're studying the same species in an area without people, what is the difference in flight initiation distance? And we did a meta-analysis of that tolerance. And what we found was that tolerance itself is an economic decision. The type of contrast we have has the largest effect on tolerance. So rural versus urban areas, or rural versus suburban, or natural versus urban, how this was defined had a huge effect on tolerance. And for terrestrial animals, and this was lizards, mammals, birds, we found that this rural-urban dichotomy explained a substantial amount of the variance and was a big effect. Body mass also explained it. Now, in these other species, what we found was big-bodied animals flushed at greater distances. And for years, I was going around and saying, we should be careful about conserving big-bodied animals. But big-bodied animals were also those most likely to acquire tolerance in some way. Why? Well, they're probably paying the biggest cost of being disturbed. So I think now it sort of changes the question, and it sort of says, well, if we want to conserve animals, we need to understand which animals can tolerate people, but if they tolerate people, probably larger ones are going to habituate or through some other mechanism be relatively tolerant of people. But maybe the smaller ones we have to worry about, more people influencing their behavior. Diogo and I also developed a number of studies where we looked at this idea of, what drives flight initiation distance. And, the farther you are away and start walking towards something, animals have to start paying attention to you. They have to start monitoring your approach. And I call this the flush early and avoid the rush hypothesis, the fear hypothesis. And it turns out that it holds in birds and mammals and lizards, more so when lizards are approached rapidly than when they're approached slowly. So if we're using these ideas of flight initiation distance to think about reserve design, we probably want to have large buffer areas around areas with vulnerable species. And we probably want to keep people relatively far away and not have them disturb animals. So again, as I said, there are a number of implications. First of all, this research has stimulated many other studies that used FID. It's not only to ask interesting ecological questions about life history, trade-offs, and risk-taking, but also that how we might apply these. Larger species may be initially vulnerable to human disturbance. They're disturbed by us. Body size is associated with FID. But, and indeed, if we make the assumptions that animals don't habituate to people, then it turns out that if you develop a model, we developed an individual-based model, large birds, which are more easily disturbed, have lower expected fitness than smaller birds. But those species that can coexist with humans, that can tolerate them, may end up acquiring tolerance. I think future research needs to parameterize models with real species, apply it to real problems, study filtering, what allows species to coexist with people in the first place, and to look at these tolerance processes. And I think people all over the world now are studying flight initiation distance and these things along human gradients, and we're developing these really interesting global data sets with which we're asking, colleagues and I are asking a number of questions about foundational evolutionary and ecological processes, but also about tolerance to humans. I want to move on and briefly talk about anthropogenic noise. So we know that noise can mask biologically important signals and change signal structure. Human-created noise can create physiological stress and affect fitness. It can change population distributions. It can directly harm animals. So it's thought that loud noises in the ocean might drive marine mammal strandings. Also, it turns out that noise distracts animals. And when you think about distraction, I'm going to suggest something we call the distracted prey hypothesis. Any stimulus an animal can perceive is capable of distracting it by reallocating part of its finite attention and preventing it from responding to an approaching threat. And all animals, attention is finite. Attention is something that you can focus on one thing or focus on something else, but you can't focus it everywhere. It's divisible. And it can be therefore compromised by stimuli in multiple modalities. If someone walks into your office now and starts taking off their clothes, you're going to look towards that rather than me, and you're not going to listen to what I'm saying. So this idea that you can be distracted by visual stimuli to some sort of an acoustic stimuli, that there are multiple modalities here, but attention can be captured in different modalities and affect assessment within one modality, is an important idea. And it turns out that birds, mammals, reptiles, and vertebrates all use attention, fishes, to focus on relevant stimuli. We looked at hermit crabs, terrestrial hermit crabs living in the US Virgin Islands. And instead of looking at flight initiation distance, we defined hiding initiation distance. So the hermit crabs would withdraw into their shell when they were experimentally approached, when we walked towards them. And we had a number of treatments. We had silence versus boat motor noise, because motorboats were going around the island all the time. And we then created what I call the disco party boat, which was noise and noise with a strobe. And again, a walking person. So we found that crabs can be approached much more closely when boat noise is broadcast. We could get closer to them before they closed. And then we sort of created a looming object where we had this black thing here, no vibration, just loom at them. And the same thing, we could get this closer to them when boat motor noise would broadcast. And then when we added another modality, boat and lights, we could walk more closely to them. So again, this is very consistent with distraction. Distraction is something that's really important. Now, many species habituate to human disturbances. They become less distracted over time, maybe. Habituation is a decline in responsiveness to a stimulus with repeated exposure. But some animals actually sensitize. They have increased responsiveness to a stimulus with repeated exposure. So we've known for well over 100 years that animals may habituate, animals may sensitize. But we don't really understand the natural history of this. We don't understand the conditions under which they habituate or the conditions under which they sensitize. And I think that's really important. And I think it's important when we think about ecotourism, among other things. Can ecotourists impair survival? There's an assumption that if animals habituate to us, they transfer that habituation to real predators. And if that's true, which may happen in some cases, that's a bad thing. So we looked at this in dictycs. Gunther's dictycs are eaten by about 36 species of mammals and birds. They live in East Africa. We looked at them in Kenya, in the savannah there. And assessing risk to them is really important. Now, lots of species respond to the sounds of their predators and take evasive action. And we capitalized on this with dictycs. Turns out dictycs are really smart. For this study, we broadcast jackal calls and bird song within about 5 kilometers of where humans lived and greater than 5 kilometers of human habitation. And it turns out dictycs defend little territories. They're monogamous. A male and a female defend their territory. They have a prehensile nose and they sniff around. And when we broadcast these jackal calls, they sniffed. In another experiment, we broadcast raptor vocalizations, and they didn't sniff, they looked up for the raptors. So they really know what's going on. They've learned or they've evolved to be very attuned to their predators. And what we found was that unhabituated dictycs were not able to discriminate between the sounds of predators and benign sounds. So if we look at how dictycs responded within a kilometer, they distinguished and they responded differently by their vigilance between birdsong and jackals. They were more vigilant, they foraged less, and they increased their nose twitching. We found no differences further away. Ecotourists at more pristine places are likely to disturb animals and distract them and interfere with their risk assessment. And we noticed that. The dictycs were essentially paying attention to us and not these other things in their environment. Turns out mule deer too. Did an experiment in Colorado where I work with mule deer, and we found that, again, within 5 kilometers of where people lived, mule deer made these discriminations, in this case between marmot alarm calls and sparrow sounds. They pay attention to marmots, but far away, they didn't make this discrimination because they were responding to us being too close to them. I think, more work has to be done on the spatial ecology of fear. We worked with western gulls in Santa Monica, on the beaches near Santa Monica, where lots of people in Los Angeles go. And if you go towards Venice, the crazy place with all sorts of people on the boardwalk there, we found that that you could, the distance you could get to western gulls before they fled didn't change much. But as you got away towards Topanga, where fewer people were on the beach, we found increased flight initiation distances. Now, in many cases, so there's a spatial geography of fear here. Now, in many cases, we put fences places to prevent people from going. And are these effective or not? So here we capitalized on a place which is where the U.S. Navy stores all their weapons for the Pacific, called Seal Beach. And very few people are allowed to go there. We got permission to go there. We were thrown out after 9/11, but nonetheless. And then there was this wetland, and there are very few wetlands in Southern California. And part of it was an ecotourist area, and part of it was an area where people couldn't go because it was active oil exploration. And what we found was, and it was fenced, and what we found was that flight initiation distances for a number of different species of birds were systematically higher where people didn't go compared to where people went. So Bolsa Chica and Bolsa Oil, same wetland, fence divided it. And when we looked at birds in that wetland where people were, they habituated. Fences may afford safety, but not all species may habituate. We looked at a variety of chaparral birds in California, and we found that, if anything, species living in some areas may have sensitized to high disturbance. Now, chaparral is contiguous habitat. And while it's under threat from development in Southern California, it sort of led me to think maybe there's something where if you're in limited habitats like wetland fragments, the only animals that can live there have to be tolerant of people and are more likely to habituate to human disturbance than those living in more contiguous habitats. So, what about habituation? It's key to predicting how animals will respond to humans and our stimuli. It's a mechanism leading to tolerance. Not all species may habituate. The contiguous habitat hypothesis needs to be tested. More stimuli, both in quantity and quality, may be more disturbing. The lack of habituation to our stimuli may enhance human impacts on wildlife. Dik-diks and mule deer are distracted by people. I didn't talk about this here, I pulled it out. Lizards, it turns out, are distracted by cameras. Marmots too, we just did a study on that. And that the spatial scale of habituation can be stark. It can occur, on either side of a fence, or it can be gradual and occur over several kilometers. And trying to understand the spatial ecology of this is important. I'm going to just highlight a paper that, if you're interested, you should have a look at. Many species lose their predators, and that has ecological and evolutionary consequences, and it has important implications for conservation and management. Predator naivete, where prey lose their ability to respond to their predators, is a big thing, and it's a big cause of conservation failures, and it's a big cause of extinctions when novel predators come onto islands. Alex Carthy and I came up with a sort of a framework for thinking about how ecological and evolutionary experience can influence predator recognition. And really what it comes down to is, are animals able to discriminate among predator cues or non-predator cues? And if they do, do they have an appropriate response? And if that response is not appropriate, that can be a problem and suggests or might lead to techniques to inculcate fear or train animals or select animals to be more responsive to predators. And I don't want to go into this more other than saying this is all about predation, it's all about conservation, and it requires a mechanistic understanding. Read the tree paper if you're interested in it. So I really ran through a lot of things right now just to provide sort of a set of ways that I think about how anti-predator behavior can be important for thinking about conservation and wildlife management. I think the main take-home messages are we need more work to develop mechanistic models that predict how animals respond to humans. We can use flight initiation distance as a metric to gain insight into how animals perceive risk. And I know many people here are marine scientists. I and others have used flight initiation distance in marine ecosystems as well. Anthropogenic stimuli may distract animals and enhance vulnerability to predators, which is interesting. Not all animals habituate to disturbances, and we need to know the conditions under which animals habituate versus when they sensitize. We need to test models of persistence of anti-predator behavior under relaxed selection. And some colleagues and I are doing a meta-analysis of this now. It's actually really hard to do, but hopefully we'll have some insights from that. But I think more importantly, all of these ideas can be applied to solve conservation problems, but they have to be tested in an adaptive management framework. And I think that the first step in adaptive management is, does it work? And the second step, and again, I think all of this follows from the lead and insights from biomedical work, is not only does it work, but is it cost effective? If it's not cost effective, I'm completely agnostic. While I'm a cheerleader and think that there are many ways that behavior can be used to solve conservation and management problems, if it's not cost effective, we shouldn't waste the money and we should do other things. And I guess, these days I'm reading and working much more in a socio-ecological systems framework. And I think that we really need to cast these questions in an SES framework, because if we want to come up with sustainable management and sustainable solutions to our biodiversity threats, if we want to avoid a ghastly future, as I and others have written about. We really need to foundationally and fundamentally understand that humans, and recognize that humans are part of our solution and are part of these ecosystems, and we have to be respectful of human diversity and needs as well. So with that, I'm going to see if I can quit out of here, and I'm going to stop my sharing, I hope, and maybe I can see people. Of course I can't stop my sharing because I can't see people. Hang on. And now I can see Juan, Pablo. So hopefully now I'm delighted to try to answer any questions you may have.
Ok, thanks, Daniel, for your excellent presentation. Now, pessoal, estamos abertos agora para as perguntas para o Daniel. Pode ser feitas em português ou em inglês, e eu vou tentar ler para ele as perguntas. Well, Daniel, I have several questions about your presentation. For example, how do your recommendation for try to apply the distance, the fitting in marine organisms, for example? I know several people here in Brazil using this approach, using for example, reef fish, and try to understand how the scuba diving or fishing interacting with the human people, but how you can reveal more conservation strategies, for example, for this species.
Yeah, great question. So a number of people are studying flight initiation distance in fish all over the world. A number are working in Brazil as well, doing this. And what I think is really interesting, I teach a field and marine biology course every other year. And for the last, 10 years, we've been going to Marinha, French Polynesia. And, students have looked at how the same species responds on a marine protected area and off a marine protected area. And there are other people working with FIDs and divers and FIDs and protection levels. And I think the take-home message is that understanding how fish view us, because if people are spearfishing them or otherwise harvesting them, they should be afraid of us. And on marine protected areas where they're truly protected, they should allow us to get closer to them. But as you get closer to the border of an MPA, if they're responding fearfully, maybe that MPA is leaky, or maybe the fish are moving, and that's telling you again about the spatial ecology of fear. So I think the take-home message really is important, that these are ways of understanding how animals perceive us, and that's important because could have insights into how our protection is working in these various areas. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for studies, of this in different systems. And importantly, we found in Marinha that even an unharvested fish was responding fearfully to humans on an MPA, probably because people were going around and killing other fish. And fish are really smart at learning quickly that there are death pheromones in the air, when their skin is broken. So they were equating humans, even benign humans, with fearful stimuli.
Yeah, you have one comment about the Isabella Rocha, is one people here, and she's comment is about this specific behavior in this species in marine protection areas. It's more friendly. The species in this area is no fear, and it's very curious because when you see this species in the continent or a specific area, you have more pressure. This species is very fast. It's not static or swimming very near.
I think these are fascinating questions to just understand, how animals work. But I think to me, the exciting challenge is applying knowledge. And, in various disciplines, what I do is I try to take an understanding of something and figure out a way to apply it. So again, biomedical research is a really good example of how people have done that in the past. And I think that conservation has a lot to learn about the application of knowledge from physicians and biomedical researchers. And I think that personally, animal behaviorists in general take a much more pluralistic Tinbergian approach to thinking about the application of knowledge. So I also work and co-founded and work in the field of evolutionary medicine. Co-founded a center at UCLA. And, but a lot of biomedical work is very proximate. It's very, what is the gene associated with this disease? But trying to understand things in a much richer way, adopting Nico Tinbergen's, 4 levels of analysis, where we can look at, proximate immediate causation, where we can look at development, where we can look at the evolutionary history, and we can also look at the current adaptive utility, may give us new insights into treating human health problems. And I think that's really, an insight that many people in animal behavior, that approach, a Tinbergian approach, even though we need mechanistic levers to manipulate behaviors in many cases, many of us understand that, we can look at the natural history and evolutionary history of vulnerability to people. We can look at the development of, habituation or learning to tolerate people. We can look at this from, well, maybe some stimuli are evolution proof. So for example, why do fish always go for fish lures? Well, because, you can be duped, but, you have to go eat things. So nets are something that, we can work with. We can put turtle exclusion devices on fish nets to allow them to be more detectable, or dolphin exclusion devices on fish nets to allow them to be more detectable. The fish don't see them, but you can design things to let other things out of them. But, fishing hooks are never going to be, fishing lures are always going to be effective, because animals have to, tolerate some mistakes, if you will, in order to eat. Now, what's interesting is spearfishing is a different game completely. So Valerio Chabaria, I believe his name is this amazing Italian fishery scientist, and he's been thinking a lot about the sort of evolutionary dynamics of spearfishing, and between the humans and the fish. And there's an evolutionary arms race going on there. As spearfishers develop, other techniques and camouflage, we expect the fish to evolve defenses in ways that we don't expect fish to evolve defenses against fish hooks, because one is about fear and the other is about feeding.
Oh, very interesting. Well, you mentioned the fly initiation is one ecological and behavioral adaptation, but one question I have is, for example, how this behavior is transmitted for another generation, because the father, learning about this behavior for try to evade predators, but not necessarily this knowledge is for another generation. How do you suppose this ecological adaptation persists in the time?
There are a couple of ways. First, as we know from fishes, and fishes are the really good learners. Fish are smart. Maud Ferrari's work shows that fish are primed to learn the sense of their predators and other stimuli. They're more likely to learn predators that are closely related to important predators. Truly novel predators are harder to learn, but they can still learn them, right? So learning is a mechanism by which, if you're primed to learn, if you've been selected to learn, every generation can learn what's relevant for them. And fish are a perfect example of that. Epigenetic modification can essentially make animals more wary as well. So if you were growing up in a situation with predators, maybe you're going to be more wary in that next generation. Maybe if your mom grew up with predators, you're going to be epigenetically modified in ways to be more wary. And then there's selection and evolution. So what I didn't talk about today is a really exciting project we're doing in Australia. Not that I can go to Australia anymore, but my colleagues are there. And we've been actually putting in animals that were driven extinct by cats and foxes. In one case on the mainland, in other case populations have drastically been decreased because of cats and foxes. So we're working with a species called burrowing bettongs, which are a rat kangaroo, and we're working with a species called the greater bilby, which is sort of a rugby ball sized marsupial. These are active at night, and they've been decimated in many places by cats and foxes, which have been introduced into Australia. And my colleagues created this large 126 square kilometer cat-proof and fox-proof fenced area. And they have large paddocks in there. And we know, 36 square kilometers, 26 square kilometers. And we know that if you create a cat-proof and fox-proof fence and you put in things, we took animals from offshore islands in one case, put them in there, no predators except eagles, the populations explode. We took an animal that was extinct on mainland Australia, and for a while, before a long drought, we had 8,500 of them. So, they do really well. Then we said, well, let's start. We have some control paddocks where we're not going to expose them to cats. And then we have treatment paddocks where we're going to start putting in more and more cats. And we're going to follow how they change over time. And what we seem to have found is that for the burrowing bettongs, we have morphological and behavioral changes over time. There are differences between the control treatment and our cat treatment. Mm-hmm. We also found that if there are too many cats there, they'll eat the bettongs and the bilbies. But that says we can have coexistence with these animals. The populations increased for many years. So the question really is about coexistence with predators and coexistence thresholds. Wow. We also found that if you take these animals, bettongs and bilbies, exposed to cats and not cats, and you then put them into an area with cats, there's no difference in bettong survival, but there are differences in bilby survival. So this may not work for all species, but this idea of exposing animals to predators for multiple generations either teaches them about how to survive with predators or they evolve. We have unpublished results now where we've done common garden experiments, and we think at least some of these differences are evolved differences over a number of generations. So, maybe this doesn't work for everything, but the challenge in Australia is, sure, you can build predator-proof fences, but do you want that to be the only way that animals can exist? Sure, you can put animals on offshore predator-free islands, but is that the only way to exist? Or can we figure out how to restore ecologies, frankly, with some cats and foxes, in the foreseeable future, probably forever? And the answer seems to be maybe. Stay tuned. We're really excited about this. Doesn't work for everything, works for some things, but it gets at your broader question of, can you create evolutionary responses? And we think we can.
Okay. Well, you have one question here, the Isabella, is how long time do you spend doing the research to understand how this behavior response working in the animal you present here? You can read the question in the chat.
Yeah, I don't see the chat. Oh, here we go. So many of these studies, now I see the chat. Many of these studies are, so I'm really big on meta-analyses and comparative analysis. So I'll go out with students and we'll do a focused study. But when we look at lots of species, we can begin to understand, evolutionary trends and broader scale trends. So I'm really interested in not only doing empirical studies, which I've been doing for, 30 years, but going out and then doing the comparative studies and the meta-analyses, which bring together, many, many different studies. And there's a bunch of us now working with flight initiation distance stuff from all over the world, really working with hundreds of thousands of flushes on, maybe we're pushing 1,000 birds now, looking at these and drawing some broader conclusions that are really interesting. So I think that, anyone can make a contribution to these data sets, and then, and that's important. But also the bigger collaborative projects, I think, are really important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have another question about the Alvaro here. Is congratulations your presentation. How expect in the forest species maintain a behavior pattern, and what expect the will influence the dispersion of the species?
Yeah. So, why do big species? Why is body size associated with tolerance? And I think that all comes down to costs, right? So, if a big species absolutely has to forage more and spend more time foraging than a small species, then there's going to be strong selection on it to be smart. There's going to be strong selection on it to learn to potentially learn to be tolerant of people. So I think that you're absolutely right. Thinking about costs and benefits of these responses is key to understanding the patterns we see. This idea of the contiguous habitat hypothesis is all about costs and benefits. If you live in contiguous habitat and people come around, you can go away. So maybe species are more annoyed or more sensitized to humans, or more likely to be sensitized to humans in contiguous habitats, contrasted to, say, the only place you can live. If the only place you can live is a place where humans are, because we have no wetlands in Southern California, we've developed them all, we've ruined them all. These wetlands are essential habitat. If you can tolerate people, you're going to be more tolerant of them where people are. So I think that it really is taking an adaptive framework. It's thinking like a behavioral ecologist, as you are, that allows us to make sense of these patterns. And that's what colleagues and I are trying to do.
Excellent. Well, I work in cleaning species here in Brazil and other parts, and see the behavior and the mutualist behavior, and read different articles mention about the segregation of different hormones for stay very happy the species when interacting. But my question is just now about the stress hormones and this distance, or how the species answer when you found, for example, one human, or how is the quality for the stress in this species?
So it's great question. Eduardo Bessa and Benjamin Joffrey have been doing a bunch of stuff with freshwater fishes and ecotourism in Brazil, and shows that this is a place where people, Curibata, I believe, I forget where exactly, where people go and swim with freshwater fishes in this crystal clear, beautiful water. And
Bonito is the name of the place.
yeah, and the fish come up and sort of eat, skin fragments off people and clean people. But it turns out the fish are really stressed by this. And, feeding animals, you get them to come closer to you, but that doesn't mean they're not stressed. So if there are consequences of chronic stress, that physiological understanding is really important to understand how to manage ecotourism. And colleagues and I edited a book. I showed you a picture of it before, Ecotourism's Promise and Pearl. So Diogo and Benjamin and Eduardo and I edited this book, and there's a chapter in here that Benjamin wrote, thinking about physiology and reviewing the physiological responses. So I think that all of these tools and techniques give us insights and give us mechanistic insights on coexistence with humans. All of these tools and techniques are important to think about in this context. So I think that you're spot on. We need to do these studies. I'm doing stuff with epigenetics now in marmots right now, but epigenetic insights tell you the history of exposure to stress. Early childhood experience in humans, bad experiences, trauma, lead to increased epigenetic marking on a suite of genes in humans, is associated with bad health outcomes and reductions in longevity. And what we're doing with marmots now is, I run a population of where we've studied marmots for 60 years now. My colleague started it. I'm not even 60 years old. Close, but not quite. And we're able to look at longevity and factors that influence longevity. So we're coming up with ways of thinking about cumulative negative impacts early in life and looking for these, both in terms of a suite of fitness traits, but also in terms of epigenetic modification. And we have, and many people are developing these, but there are ways of saying, here is your chronological age, and it's very associated with epigenetic age. In other words, as animals age, they accumulate, epigenetic changes. And then, but there's a bit of variation. Some individuals have more of it, some individuals have less of it. So you could say that here's an individual that's had experiences that stressed it out, that makes it older than would be expected based on its chronological age. Does that have consequences? These are the questions we're interested in. And importantly, the human literature has been good at thinking about cumulative impacts. So you're raised in a really low relative socioeconomic background. Your father killed your mother in front of you. You were hungry. You didn't have a lot of education. There was a lot of violence in your neighborhood. This is associated with really bad health outcomes. And people are coming up with ways in humans to think about these cumulative impacts. Well, in wildlife, we have overfishing. We have climate change. We have, changes in pH. I'm just thinking about marine systems right now. We have boat motor noise. We have, mining and oil exploration related noises. We have sunscreen for people going and looking at them. We have people feeding fishes and stressing them out. Don't feed animals. Don't feed anything. Don't feed fish. Don't put a bird feeder out. Feeding is just is a really bad thing. So developing ways to think about these cumulative stressors and identifying points in the life where these cumulative stressors have an impact, I really think is the future of going forward. And some of these cumulative stressors are predation related, and others, cumulative stressors, are other sorts of things that animals experience that stress them out, essentially. So I think thinking about stressors is the way to bring all of these together. And we're doing a bunch of that right now.
Perfect. Pessoal, mais perguntas para o Daniel? Ainda temos mais alguns minutos mais para algumas outras perguntas para discutir com o Daniel aqui. Well, Daniel, I think you're talking in this discussion about for example, life history traits in this species, and you found the answer traits and response traits, on two different traits, because you want to associate for a specific immediate answer for when you have one intervention or modification, and you have another trait is more long time. But in your opinion, you mentioned the body size is important trait, and you mentioned the trophy level, but how trait you suppose is important in this case for try to understand the flight initiation distance, for example?
So I think that if you look at the effect sizes in each of these studies where I summarize those, you can go back to the meta-analyses, and this is where meta-analysis is really important, because it says, well, this is one species, but what do we know in general based on whatever evidence we have at the time? And Diego has been amazing at running these meta-analyses. But at the end of the day, if you're living near people or not, if you're just, rural, urban, explains a lot. How many, it's here and now. You have to survive an immediate exposure to a threat in order to, live longer, right? But body size seems to be a relatively important one. And body size is a life history trait. And these decisions are cast in a life history framework. Now, one of the things we're struggling with right now is when you think about development, when you think about early stressful experiences, the impact of that is diluted over time, right? So, animals can compensate, plants can compensate, organisms can compensate for bad experiences. Not everyone who grows up in a horrible, condition is traumatized forever. Not everyone, has a shorter life. Compensation can happen. You could have a bad year and you can catch up in your growth rate. Understanding that compensation is important. So I think immediate stressors should always be more important. I mean, it's a really good question. Immediate stressors should be important because these are an immediate threat to your livelihood. The fight or flight response is important. But if your flight or flight response is on all the time, that causes costs. That causes, wear and tear. And that can't be good. But other things can be important as well. And we see sort of coevolutionary patterns, I think, in how these things play out. Certain species that have certain diets might detect people coming in threats at a greater distance. If you eat live food, you might be more, attuned to movement as opposed to eating moving, plants, for example. If you eat moving food rather than plants, you might be more sensitive to movements. If you're social, you might be more sensitive to movements because you're, selected also to pay attention to, what's going on. These effect sizes are smaller than other more immediate threats, but cumulatively they do explain variation in these traits, and therefore might be important for management.
Well, maybe it's very crazy my comment this moment, but I can suppose, for example, the flying distance is one metric or one priority when you try to selection or mediate for predation, because you have all the stress and cumulative learning about the different generation, and probably you difference selection for one specific life history traits, for example. I expect this arising new species or arising new genus. No, I don't know. It's only one crazy comment about your comment about now. This moment.
Well, I think a couple things are going on. One, again, work with Benjamin Joffrey and some other people has shown that that people living around people domesticate species and leads to the whole syndrome of responses you have with domestication. Domestication, of course, is much stronger. It's artificial selection. Even bringing species into captivity and not really living around them, but trying to raise them in captivity leads to the same pattern of responses. So we're having an effect on a suite of responses above and beyond flight initiation distance. There's a lot of studies on flight initiation distance because it's easy. But when you start looking at different anti-predator traits, which I think you have to, it's much more complex. And I think with our marmots, we study a variety of anti-predator traits, and we see, I don't have a good summary. I don't have a good immediate summary of this right now, and we're still doing these studies, but different traits respond differently to humans. Not everything is an anti-predator syndrome, but this gives us insights into what traits are a syndrome. And syndromes and ways, tolerant syndromes and other sorts of syndromes, may vary as a function of living around people, harvesting, etc. So I think there's a lot of room for detailed single species studies that go down and really understand what's going on in a particular system, and that these sort of inform and frame how we should be paying attention to single trait studies that might be across many species. So I'm quite enthusiastic. I also recognize it's a little more complex than maybe I'm saying.
Ok. Ok, pessoal, mais perguntas? Temos ainda minuto mais para nossa conversa de hoje. Bom, thanks again, Daniel, for accepting this invitation. It's very pleasure your presentation. Your presentation today is very nice, amazing, and well, I invited you for another presentation the next Thursday. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And you can read some of these things at your own leisure. All my papers are on my website. And if you want to talk about collaborations, I always want to learn from other people and with other people. And I love Brazil, and I want to get back to Brazil at some point. And please stay healthy.
Yeah, thank you. Bye bye.
Take care.
Take care.